You know, converting a school bus or building out any type of rig, especially for off-grid use, is full of tons of choices. One of the biggest choices you'll make when you're designing your off-grid electrical system is what voltage you want to run your batteries at. In the past, 12 volts was fine. Our systems were smaller and we were content. But now that we can put thousands of watts on the roof and we have mini splits we want to run, sometimes bumping that up to a higher voltage for the battery bank really makes a lot of sense. In today's video, I'm going to compare the advantages of 24 volt systems to those of 12 volt systems. We'll go through all of the pros and cons, explain why you might want to do a 24 volt system or even upgrade to one if your system's already built. And then I'm going to show you how I'm upgrading the system on this bus right behind me from a 12 volt system to a 24 volt system so that we can run a bigger solar panel array on the roof and keep the same size charge controller. My name's Chuck Cassady. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be saying the word voltage a lot today, and that's got me pretty charged up. Check it out. All right, to get started on this whole journey that we're about to go on, we've got to start by learning an equation that I love. It's one of my favorite equations in the world, and it's this power equation here. Power equals voltage times current, or in our case, watts equals volts times amps. Simple equation, but it's going to unlock a world of electrical understanding that you're going to be using whether you're working on AC, DC, high voltage, low voltage. It's all applicable. So perk those ears up and tune in because we're about to dial in some knowledge for you. In this bus, right now, they have a 12 volt battery system. The new owners want to upgrade that system to a 2,000 watt solar array on the roof. It was once, I think, 400 or 600, not much at all. Let's take a look at how that's going to appear to our batteries if we're running a 12 volt battery system. So since watts equals volts times amps, we can now solve that equation for amps by dividing watts by volts. I know I'm losing you math people who are afraid of math. I know I'm losing you, but hang in there. So if we rework the equation so that amps equals watts divided by volts, we can plug in our numbers here and see what they're going to look like. We'll take our 2,000 watt solar array coming in at 12 volts. How many amps is that going to be? It's going to be 166 amps coming out of that charge controller and into the batteries. The only problem is our charge controller can only take 100 amps of power and output that into the batteries. After that point, it's just maxed out and you're wasting all of that solar. It's hitting the panels, but only 100 amps can come out of that charge controller. Now let's rework that equation and we're going to bump up to a 24 volt battery bank. I'm going to show you what happens. We take our same 2,000 watt solar array coming in at 24 volts now, and boom, now we're at 83 amps. And you know why that's good? Because our charge controller with its 100 amp capacity can put out 83 amps all day long, no problem. In short, the way to summarize this is that the relationship of voltage and amperage are linked and they're linear such that if you double the voltage, you half the amperage. Does that make sense? So if we're running, say, a 1200 watt load, call it a space heater, and we're running that 1200 watt load at, say, 12 volts of DC power, that's going to be 100 amps because 12 volts times 100 amps gets us that 1200 watt number that we want. Now let's take that same space heater and plug it into a 120 volt wall outlet. And how many amps are we going to be pulling now? So if we've got 120 volts and it's a 1200 watt space heater, it's only going to take 10 amps of power. So as you can see, by changing the operating voltage of an appliance that uses the same amount of power, the amount of amperage required to supply that power to the appliance changes. What we want to pay attention to when we are building our off-grid electrical systems, a lot of the time is going to be the amperage rating of the appliances or the charge controllers or the solar panels or whatever it is that we're using, because amperage is actually how we decide what gauge of wire to use. If you're using, say a 20 amp circuit, oftentimes that'll be 12 gauge wire. There's standards and there's tables for all of this, and so we have to pay critical attention to the amperage on each circuit so that we can size it and operate it safely. Now you can probably imagine that in general, the less amperage we have, the safer that circuit is going to be. Amperage, when you have it at really high levels, 100, 200 amps, you can start having things where you're generating lots of heat in these conductors because they're moving so much power. The conductors themselves are very expensive, and so it's a wise idea to, whenever possible, optimize your system for smaller conductors and lower amperages. It's just going to be a nicer, safer system. So that said, you can see why the people who own this bus, because they want to do a larger solar array and because they want to put in a bigger inverter and be able to run a mini split, bumping everything up to 24 volts really makes a whole lot of sense, and that's why we're going to be doing it here. And for probably 95% of the people that I design off-grid solar systems for and the bus conversions I've done, they're going with a 24 volt system. Unless your system is going to have less than about 1200 watts of solar and around 2000 watts of inverter demand on that system, you really want to go up to a 24 volt system. If you're under those thresholds, you can stick at 12 volts and really not have too many of the drawbacks. But once you get above that size, going to 24 volts really starts to become appealing. Now, it's true, a lot of the loads in these buses and off-grid rigs are 12 volt DC loads. So how do we power those now that our batteries are at 24 volts? And the answer is a step-down converter like this one. This one's made by Victron. It's an Orion 70 amp 24 to 12 volt step-down converter. It's a great unit. 70 amps at 12 volts is more than enough power for the vast majority of rigs, unless you have a really high 12 volt DC load, like say a rooftop air conditioner that's a 12 volt model. You might need to get a second one of these. If you're doing this upgrade, the only other things you're going to have to modify are the inverter, because inverters are always designed to work with a specific battery bank voltage in mind. And of course, you'll probably want to pick up new batteries. Now, getting to 24 volts can be done with a couple of 12 volt batteries. You can wire those two batteries in series, which is connecting the negative to the positive of those two batteries and linking them together in that way so the voltages add up. But I don't like to do that, and I'll tell you why. So a lot of lithium batteries, for example, they're all going to have a BMS inside of them. The BMS is a battery management system. It's in charge of the battery, no pun intended. And if it sees something it doesn't like, it shuts the battery down to prevent a fire and protect the batteries and keep you safe. That's great, right? Well, let's imagine a scenario where you have two 12 volt batteries wired up in series to make 24 volts, and one of those batteries gets too cold, or it gets too hot, or maybe the BMS just has a glitch and it shuts that battery off. Well, now you no longer have a 24 volt system. You might not even have a system at all, depending on how that BMS is wired off. You might just drop to 0 volts, but I can guarantee you'll drop down to at least 12 volts. And 12 volts is not going to be enough to run a 24 volt inverter or to power your step-down converter. That's a major bummer, and it's just because one of your battery BMSs didn't like what was happening and shut it down. A way around that is to buy 24 volt batteries from the beginning, and since you're going to have more than one of them, most people are going to have 2 to 4 or maybe more, especially if they've got a lot of loads, which they'll be running on a 24 volt system now. One of those batteries going down doesn't take your whole system out with it. If you lose one of 2 or 3 or 4 24 volt batteries, your operating voltage is still going to be up in the parameters that your inverter and step-down converter want to see to stay on and running. That's why I really don't like wiring batteries in series to get to 24 volts, especially if they have a BMS inside of them, which all lithium batteries do, when you can just buy a 24 volt battery ready to go, and if one of them goes down or you need to swap one, it means your system stays up. Uptime is critical when you're counting on this system to run your whole life and maybe even the way that you make money on the road. Wow. Well, we've covered a lot of theory. I know, wake up in the back, We talked about math, and that's a cardinal sin in YouTube videos. But thanks for sticking around. If you want to know how we are going to do this, that's what we're going to jump into next. We're going to be converting this bus from a 12 volt system to a 24 volt system. I'm going to really quickly just talk to you about the things you're going to need, which is pretty simple. We've got our 24 volt battery. We're going to be doing 2 of these. These are my favorite battery. They're the Signature Solar Life Power EG4 batteries. Bang for the buck, these cannot be beat. You can get these at times for as little as $1,300 if they're on sale. But they are no frills. They don't have a display. I don't generally suggest getting a battery with a display unless you really need to know that information you know, for reasons that I can't quite understand, but it is a cool feature if you got the money and want to splurge. Otherwise, these have all you need. They've got the same great BMS inside of them. They've got a built-in breaker, which I really like, and they are that rack mount size that I'm a big fan of. It's easy to install, easy to stack, you know, manipulate and fit into spaces. And since it's standardized, down the road, if you want to swap it out for a different battery, you know it's going to fit because all these rack mount batteries are the same. There's a link, an affiliate link you can click on if you want to buy these. I just like them. I've installed at this point maybe close to 100 of them, or recommended at least that many, and we've had no problems with these batteries. They're super reliable, great quality cells, and good BMSs. If I find a better battery, I'll let you know, but for now, this is my top pick. Now, we're also going to need that step-down converter, like I mentioned. This is what we're going to use to generate 12 volts from our 24-volt batteries. This is a Victron Orion. You know I'm a big fan of the Victron stuff, but you can also go pick up step-down converters off Amazon. There's a lot of good options out there, and even the cheaper ones, the circuitry is so simple, even the cheaper ones are still going to hold up just fine for you. I like this because it's a pretty high output unit. It can be enough to run a whole bus, and that's pretty great. And then last, but certainly not least, the most expensive part of this whole project, well, maybe aside from the batteries, is the inverter. Now, the inverter always has to match your battery's voltage. You can't run a 24-volt inverter on a 12-volt battery system and vice versa. You have to match the two, and so since we're going to a 24-volt battery, that means we need a 24-volt inverter. We're going to be replacing the lovely 12-volt Victron unit in there with this one. It should be just a drop-in replacement. Super, super simple. And really, the step-down converter, it just gets spliced in between the output of the batteries and the 12-volt panel. That's all of the wiring that you're going to have to do, aside from just actually wiring up the batteries themselves. But again, if you've got 12-volt batteries and multiples, you can always just reconfigure the batteries that you already have and set them up to run in 24 volts. It's not the optimum way to do it, like I described earlier, but it'll certainly work just fine. And if you've got multiple pairs of 12-volt batteries adding up to your 24, that's going to give you the redundancy that would help ease some of the concerns I had that I mentioned earlier if you're seriesing 12-volt batteries to get 24 and one of them goes down. We don't want you dead in the water. We're trying to make things better around here. So without further ado, let's hop in the bus. I'm going to show you the system that we've got. You might recognize it because we've worked on this bus before. And we will get started removing the old components, swapping in the new ones, and upgrading this baby's heart, beating electrical heart. I lost it. I lost the plot. We're gonna make it better though. So let's go get started. All right, well, the astute among you may recognize this bus interior because I've worked in it and featured it in a video before where we were cleaning up some of the work done by the previous owner of this bus. So I already know this bus. I know it's gonna be pretty straightforward to do this job, but really this job should be easy in theory on pretty much any build if you did it right in the beginning. That's a big if, right? Our first move is going to be pulling these batteries out, the old 12-volt batteries. Those are made by Big Battery, who I used to recommend, but I actually don't recommend them anymore. So, and that's not because, you know, I have a deal with Signature Solar or anything like that. We actually had a Big Battery catch fire in a bus that we had built. This happened last year, and that just shouldn't be possible, you know? And then we've had a couple of issues in some other builds with them not being full capacity. So glad to see these go. Bye-bye Big Battery. And once those are out, I think I'll probably do the inverter after that and go ahead and just put the new one right in. It'll even go on the same mounting hook, which is sweet. And then I'll pick a place to mount our step-down converter and splice that in between our Lynx distributor and our 12-volt fuse panel. And we will be good to go at that point. All right, well, we better get started, am I right? All right, let me give you a preview so you can see exactly what's going on here. We've got our 12-volt inverter. It's exactly the same as our 24 from a size perspective, so the new one will just drop on. We've got our three 12-volt big batteries. Those are coming out. Those three batteries, the positives connect to that fuse, so we will just make new cables from our Signature Solar batteries to that fuse. And then the negatives just connect to that side of the shunt. We'll just reuse those connections. And then that side of things is done. Pretty straightforward. We'll have to reprogram the inverter and the charge controller, of course, for the new settings. And then we have our 12-volt load panels here, and those are supplied from the Lynx distributor. And what we're going to do is just take the lines that supply those, disconnect them from the distributor, instead feed our step-down converter off of that slot in the distributor, probably mount it over here or who knows where, somewhere nice. And then we will send that 12-volt power out of our converter into these fuse and breaker panels. Simple, right? Right. Here we go. All right, so we got the front cover of the Multi-Plus off. I've gone ahead and loosened all these, so these wires can just be pulled out now. That's their AC input and output. And go ahead and pull these battery cables off. I disconnected the networking cable that plugs in there already. Once those are off, I just have to remove the 2 screws on the bottom, and the whole thing will slide up and out. I can slide the new one in. Just like that. All right, here comes the new inverter, right back on the same bracket. Boy, that just sets right in there. All right, we'll open this up, start making some connections. Oh, I got the inverter in and wired up. I'm gonna pull you in with this camera and show you what it looks like all hooked up. Not gonna be too surprising though. You wouldn't believe it, but this is the new inverter. Looks just the same as the last one. So we're gonna go ahead and grab our main battery connections, bring them up in here. We're gonna bolt these down. And then we've got our AC connections, AC output there, AC input there. We're gonna make those. We're gonna connect our data cable, put the cover back on, and then we can begin looking at getting our converter installed. The last thing we're gonna do is put in the batteries, and we're just gonna modify. We're gonna put new lugs, I think is the plan. We're gonna put new lugs on the ends of these connectors. Cut those off, put new lugs on the end of these guys. All right, so we're all hooked in. We got our battery cables coming in, and we've got our AC cables going in and out, and our networking cable is connected. That connects into our Serbo GX here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that cover on. I almost forgot to mention, I'm gonna check and see what size fuse we have in here. It should be a 250 amp fuse. It might have been bigger. I think it was actually, but you know, we've got 4-aught here, and whatever fuse is in there, I'm sure would protect the 4-aught, but Victron, I believe, does recommend a 250 amp fuse on this. So if I've got one handy, which I know I do, I'll just go ahead and swap that. Everything else should already be good in there though. Okay, I'm a dummy because I forgot to mention one thing, and it's pretty important. If your rig has alternator charging and you are going from a 12 volt to a 24 volt system, you're gonna need to swap out your DC to DC charger. Now you probably already have one because you probably have a lithium battery bank or some type of battery bank that's getting charged by the engine alternator. And in our case, we have the Victron Orion TR Smart 12-1230. I can just swap that for a 1224, and that's going to be the exact same performance, same footprint. It'll go right in there. I apologize for not mentioning it sooner. A lot of rigs don't do the alternator charging. Depends on if it's actually, you know, something that you're driving enough to utilize and get the most out of. In truth, you really want your system to be self-sustaining without relying on alternator charging. But it is, you know, it's free energy, you know what I'm saying? I'll bring you in and I'll show you what these two look like side by side. So this is the new one. See how it goes from 12 to 24 volts at 15 amps. And then this was the old one, 12 to 12 at 30 amps. Now, remember our conversation earlier about how amperage, if you double the voltage, you can half the amperage. That's what's going on. So it's outputting at 24 volts, 15 amps. And you'll see at the bottom, it says the power is 360 watts. Same story here. It's outputting at 12 volts, 30 amps. And the output power there, also 360 watts. Same size. We're just gonna swap these two. And sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. you know? And we'll go in and we'll connect with Bluetooth and program it once it's installed as well, just like we're gonna do with the charge controller. All right, I wanna give you here's a little breakdown on how this step-down converter works. So it's got 2 positives and 1 negative, and that's because the negative is common, it's shared. So you'll connect the input and the output negative to this terminal. And if you look on here, it says output, it's this guy, and then input, which is this guy. And what we're gonna do is connect our output to these wires here. That once just came straight off the links. Now they're gonna connect to the output of the Orion, and that'll send power to all of our DC stuff. And then we will now pull off the links here with a new set of wire, just a really short one, because I think I'm gonna mount this right here. And that's gonna connect to these 2 terminals. We have the negative here and the 24-volt input here. I think I'm gonna mount this something like that. We'll see how it looks. All right, we've got a new fuse in there because it's only gonna be 40 amps coming out of here, because again, we're powering all of our DC loads. So the amps coming out of here, it was an 80 amp fuse, now it's a 40. It's gonna feed our step-down converter. We're all wired in. That's now feeding our 12-volt systems here. I'm gonna screw this down. I can't decide if I wanna put a shim there or something, but we'll get it screwed in, and then we can start bringing in the batteries, put this cover back on the links. We're in the home stretch. All right, so now that we've got the batteries in place, I'm gonna go ahead and finish making up these battery cables to connect them together, keeping in mind that we want them to be the same length, if at all possible. So we're gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll be ready to power up. Okay, so we've got our battery cables all connected, looking good. And now we're at the moment where we can power up. So we're gonna go ahead and turn these breakers on, get the batteries to do their startup thing, and then we're gonna go ahead and switch this to the on position. And there's a chance that that's going to trigger the, nope, did not trigger the BMS. That's cool. That beep was our max air coming to life. Everything's lighting up here. Oh gosh, everything's waking up. Yep, we got our backup cameras coming online. Servos coming online. There we go. Awesome. Well, that sure was painless, huh? I'm gonna go ahead and make a block to keep this secure and really wedge it in place off of this frame. And then just throw some zip ties on here. I still got to connect a ground onto that. And then we will be done. And all we got to do is go in and log into the Bluetooths and reprogram that. We're going to find the charge voltages for these batteries and program them in. I've already made a video kind of demonstrating how that happens. So I think that's going to call it for this job. A job well done, almost. Just a couple more minutes. The boring part. Nothing like the sweet sound of 24-volt juice flowing through those wires, am I right? No, but hey, that wasn't too bad. Swapping a couple components, and now we have double the output power of our charge controller, and our system's just ready to really crank the juice out in a way it wasn't before. If you found this video informative, educational, or entertaining, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we'd love to have you around. And if you want to support me directly, hit me up on the Patreon. Your money goes right into my pocket so I can keep making this type of content that hopefully brings some value to your life. And speaking of which, let me just tell you, these are the top tier Warland Warrior supporters of the Chuck Cassady channel. And this list is getting so long, I gotta read it now, which is hardly a problem. But a big thanks to Joshua Trainer, Sean Randall, Greg DeWolf, Chance, Shanti Moves, Mitchell Alliston, Scott Schur, Kitty and Moxie, Desert, Just Schoolie, Willard Williams, Marcus Henderson, CDO75, Corey Mullins, Edward Aloco, Tyler Johnson, Kyle, Cody Thompson, Patrick Riley, Gianmario, Swirly01, James Seidel, Steve Drumheller, Dan Burkett, Zachary Taylor, The Happy Fractal, Chad Foss, and Gypsy. A big thanks to all of you who support us, making this channel possible. We'll see you next time.